Open the pod bay doors.
Greetings and welcome to another exciting episode of the Cinematic Traveler Podcast. I am your intrepid movie-exploring host, Chris, and on this episode, we return to our marathon of Star Trek movie reviews. This time we have reached Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, directed by Leonard Nimoy. And I am incredibly excited to talk to you about this film, as not only is it a crowd pleaser, but it does take a little bit of a detour from our usual Star Trek films and how it's presented, which is a lot of fun to talk about, as well as the fact that we are past the halfway point in this marathon I have chosen to do, and perhaps I have bitten off a little more than I could chew, but I am having a great time watching these movies again and learning a little bit about them and giving them a review and see if they still hold up after all these years. Hopefully you're enjoying the journey with me, and if you are, somewhere on the screen of whatever you're listening to this podcast on, there is a follow button. If you will click that, I would greatly appreciate it, as it does help me and the show, but it also helps you because you won't miss any future episodes of the podcast, as well as you're able to go back and listen to my previous episode and hear all of my amazing reviews in my sexy, sexy voice. Also, if you want to leave me a rating and a review, I would appreciate that as well. Go share the show with your friends and families and enemies. I don't really care which one you share it with. Also, you can share it on social media. That's full of friends and enemies, isn't it? I'm also on social media. Speaking of that, you can find me on Instagram at the Cinematic Traveler Pod. I'm on Twitter momentarily. That one is at CMT Pod. And I'm on Blue Sky, whatever the hell that is. That one is at Cinematic Traveler Pod, something. And I do have an email address, thecinematictravelerpod@gmail.com. So you have plenty of ways to follow the show and get in touch with me and all of that fun stuff that goes along with it. There, I got through that quick, fast, and in a hurry so we can dive into this episode. But before I do, let me ask you how you doing, my beloved listener. I hope that you have been enjoying this journey that we have been taking through the 23rd century with Captain Kirk and his crew. I know I said I'm getting near the end of our 6-film marathon here, but I have been enjoying this, and I really am excited to talk about this one. So if you're ready to talk about Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, please meet me in the transporter room. Is everybody here? All right, Mr. Scott. Energize. Okay, with Star Trek IV, the one with the whales. I think that's what I'm going to call it. Once again, directed by Leonard Nimoy, coming off the success of Star Trek III. And with this film, he decided, with the heaviness of what is lovingly entitled the Genesis trilogy, Star Trek 2, 3, and 4. And we did have some serious emotional moments between Star Trek 2 and 3. He felt like this should be a little bit of a lighter movie, hence the turn into comedy that we'll get to later. And that's what's going to make this one so much fun, because it is a different movie and really the whole of the Star Trek franchise. Oh, wait a minute. Everybody calm down. Here comes Captain Kirk. I think he has something to say.
Do you mind telling me what this is all about, mister?
Yes, sir. I am going to get right on with my Star Trek IV, the one with the whales, plot synopsis. So we are back in the 23rd century, where, stop me if you've heard this one before, a mysterious alien probe is heading to Earth, leaving a wake of destruction in its path. Enter our heroes, Kirk, Bones, Scotty, Uhura, Chekhov, and Sulu, as they are heading back to Earth in their stolen Klingon ship to face the consequences of their actions in Star Trek III. Now, along for the ride is Mr. Spock. He is still trying to recover from his rebirth, with his Vulcan side basically at 100%. But he still needs to learn his human side, as well as his place with this crew again. Now, as they approach the Earth, they see that the alien probe is wreaking havoc on the planet's oceans, sending out a strange signal. Of course, Mr. Spock, being Mr. Spock, discovers that the signal is trying to reach some humpback whales. There's one slight problem. They have been extinct since the 21st century. So Admiral Kirk and crew decide to time warp around the sun to travel back to the late 1980s to find some whales and bring them back and send this probe merrily on its way. Once back in the 20th century, the crew splits up, with Kirk and Spock trying to find the whales, which leads to them encountering a whale expert, Jillian, played by the absolutely adorable Catherine Hicks, who works at a aquarium that happens to have 2 humpback whales in captivity. So eventually she decides to help Kirk and Spock. The rest of the crew becomes the fish out of water as they try to find the materials to make a tank to hold these whales in the ship, as well as get some stuff to repair some of the things that happened to the ship in the time warp, because this is a little piece of shit Klingon ship. Can't handle fucking time warp. Useless. So anyway, they're sent out to try to find something to help fix the dilithium crystals. And once the ship is repaired, they travel back to the 23rd century to save the day once again and be rewarded with a new ship, the NCC 1701-A, or as we know and love her, the USS Enterprise. And that is the basic of basic plots for this film. Now, moving into my review, if this is your first time listening to the show, or if you haven't listened in a while, I do break my reviews down into 3 segments: the good, the bad, and the nitpicky. The good are the things that I like about the movie. The bad are obviously things that I don't. And the nitpicky. And these are things that are sometimes Hollywoodisms or other times just silly things my weird little brain picks out to try to make you laugh, because I am trying with this podcast to make you laugh a little bit, because if there's 2 things on this planet I love to do, one of them is to make people laugh, and the other is to wreak havoc with my space probe. All right. So before I officially start, I do have to remind everybody, I am not doing a retrospective of Star Trek IV, the one with the whales, because I don't really want to do a whole deep dive and be on this thing for like 3 hours. You don't want that. I don't want that. Really, the whole podcast universe doesn't really want that. But I am going to inject some trivia from time to time that I found about this movie to be interesting, as well as give you the best review for Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Okay, I will give it the official title. In all the podcast universe, nay, in all of the universe. So moving into the good of the movie. Where should we start? I will say, of all the movies in this series, this one does the best job of giving everybody in the crew something to do, some adequate screen time, so you feel like you're hanging around these characters a little more, by breaking them off into the 3 teams. As I mentioned, you got Kirk and Spock, who are heading out to find the whales, and you've got Uhura and Chekhov. They're going to, I don't know what the exact mumbo jumbo is, but they have to repair the dilithium crystals, and they have this device that when they beam onto a United States aircraft carrier that is nuclear powered, they can get some kind of energy off that and fix the dilithium crystals. And of course, they beam onto the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, which was a nice little touch in the film. However, in our first little trivia here, the actual ship they are on board is the USS Ranger. The real Enterprise was out to sea during filming. Oh, that's a little bit disappointing. I shouldn't have told you that. It ruined some of the illusion. But at any rate, then you have McCoy, Sulu, and Scotty. They are off trying to find basically plexiglass to make this enclosure inside the ship so they have somewhere to put the whales. And each of these crew, I would say, of course, Kirk and Spock are going to get the most screen time, but you do get an ample amount of time with each of these members of the crew, which is fun, and it really lends itself into the comedy, which I guess we'll go ahead and say is the next positive of the film, and which makes this movie very easy to watch for non-Star Trek fans that we'll get to later, but also a nice, as I mentioned, a deviation from what we're used to in these Star Trek films, because these actors really give some amazing comedic performances. I think all of the crew interact so well. And it's also pretty cool to see these different characters interacting with each other. You usually don't see much of McCoy with Scotty in the show or whatever, and you don't see a whole lot of Uhura and Chekhov off doing things. So it was kind of cool to see them with different people. And just, I mean, come on, this is a pretty damn funny movie. The whole fish out of water thing, they sell it so perfectly here. There's always been comedy in Star Trek. In the original series, they had moments in shows, and then they also had full-on comedic episodes. The Trouble with Tribbles, A Piece of the Action. I always thought that one was pretty funny. They actually had a episode that was pretty similar to this. Tomorrow is Yesterday, where they travel back to the 1960s, and they have to deal with the Air Force. There's some pretty funny moments in that. There's one where Kirk gets captured by the military police, and he just basically tells them everything about who he really is, and they just don't believe it. It's pretty funny. You have to watch that episode. But anyway, so they've always had little bits here and there, or, the odd episode where they've actually done pure comedy. But here, most of this movie, as I mentioned, once they get back to San Francisco in the 23rd century, it's a flat-out, fish-out-of-water comedy, and these actors excel in this. You know that I have spoken highly of William Shatner throughout this series so far. And again, he continues here to surprise us with some really great comedic moments with Leonard Nimoy. I mean, come on, the part where they're in Jillian's truck and she asks him, "Do you like Italian?" And they go, "Yes, no, no," back and forth. It's just priceless. I know I can't do these jokes justice that they deserve, but they do a really great job, especially with Spock, who in this movie is much more Vulcan than human. As I mentioned, he's trying to learn his human side. You get that great moment at the beginning with the test. Correct. Correct. I'm sorry. I'm off on a tangent there. But at the end, it goes, "How do you feel? How do you feel?" So his mother's there. And she's like, you are part human. You need to learn that. And so that's kind of what his arc in this film is learning to be the full-on Mr. Spock that we knew before the events of Star Trek II and where he fits with his crew. But he's so dry in this movie. It's absolutely amazing. The whole thing with him dealing with the colorful metaphors because they have all the cussing in the film. "You double dumbass." Well, double dumbass on you. And he can't get it right because he always puts them in the wrong spot where he goes, "The hell, these are your whales," and all that shit. So it's pretty funny to see him grappling with the 20th century as a Vulcan. Of course, there's the famous scene where the guy's playing the radio and they're in the back of the bus and they ask him to turn it down and he just flips them off. So Spock leans over and gives him the old neck pinch. Again, priceless comedy. And just a little trivia in Star Trek lore, as it were. Very early on in the series, way back in the 60s, Leonard Nimoy as Spock was supposed to be in a big fight. They had a big fight scene, and he was going to scrap it out with some guys. But he went to Gene Roddenberry. He says, "You know what? I'm an alien. Wouldn't I have different ways of doing anything?" And that's how he invented the neck pinch. So a little extra trivia there for you. But again, all his interactions with Kirk playing off of each other is great. And of course, Kirk's trying to be Captain Kirk, but he's really out of his element here. All of his interactions with Jillian. I think Catherine Hicks, she's just adorable in this movie, and she's a whole lot of fun. I do have an issue with her character we'll get to later, but I think she really brings the disbelief of what these characters are telling like when she's having dinner with Kirk and she says, "You're from outer space," and he's like, "No, I'm from Iowa. I just work in outer space." And she goes, "I knew space had something to do with it." So her performance with them is great because she's so skeptical. It's almost like she's a bit of the audience, as it were. With the combination of these sort of three different story elements, you get the comedy out of that. You get the stuff with McCoy, and I love it with him and Scotty, where they're talking to the guy to get the plexiglass, and they tell him about transparent aluminum, and Bones pulls Scotty outside, and he's like, "Isn't this disrupting the timeline?" And Scotty just looks at him and goes, "Well, how do we know he didn't invent the damn thing?" That one always cracks me. And him at the computer, still one of the best, because I will do this with my computer. I will go, "Computer." I know, that's stupid. If you've seen the scene, you get it. Or where he goes, "How quaint." I think that's another line I've used from time to time when he has to type on the keyboard. Sulu, where he's in the helicopter and he flips the switch. He's being all cocky and he flips the switch and the windshield wipers come on. That's pretty good. And then when you pivot over to Uhura and Chekhov, and then again, they have great moments of comedy as well. And then Chekhov when he gets captured by the Navy, I don't know, investigators or whatever, and they're questioning him. It's a great scene because he just doesn't understand what they're trying to say to him, because he doesn't understand that at this time in the 80s, he was Russian and he's on this US aircraft carrier, so obviously they're going to treat him like an enemy, but he comes from a time when no one is an enemy, so he doesn't understand that. And then when he has this accident, Kirk wakes him up and asks him name and rank, and he goes, Chekhov Pavel, rank Admiral. It's a good laugh. There's a lot of good comedy in this movie. And again, it's nice to see these actors not only getting to do something a little different than what they've been doing, but also to get more screen time. You really get to feel like you know the crew a little better by the end of this movie, as well as Jillian. I think, again, I'm just going to praise Catherine Hicks because she did such a great job in this role as this over enthusiastic whale expert. And of course, the comedy leads into really the next positive of the movie, and that is the direction. I think for the most part, I mean, this isn't bringing anything amazing visually, although they have that weird trippy thing where they time travel and it has like them weird heads popping out of the clouds and stuff. That gets weird. Every time I watch that, I'm like, what the fuck is that? But at any rate, I don't think visually it's absolutely amazing, but I think Leonard Nimoy, and he had a massive comedy hit with Three Men and a Baby. He proves his chops here because he does something that I absolutely love. And I was watching this movie again and I was like, oh, I miss this kind of comedy where they will say a joke and the joke will breathe for a minute. So you're allowed to laugh at this comedy in a comedy movie. It seems like nowadays you get a lot of the ad lib comedy. So people are just kind of constantly talking, not saying those can't be funny, but sometimes you want to have a moment to laugh and not miss anything that's happening on the screen, if that makes sense. And this movie does a perfect job. It lets the joke breathe. It lets you go, oh, that's funny. And then they go into the dialogue. So you're not really missing anything. And I think Leonard Nimoy really sells that because he's almost Buster Keaton like in this movie, where he's the great stone face because he doesn't react to things like the way you think he would react. It really, if you watch this movie again, just enjoy the comedic performances of these actors because they're really great in this movie. And again, I love a comedy that lets you enjoy the comedy before it moves on to the next line of dialogue or the next scene. And another piece of trivia for this movie, as this is a comedy, they really wanted to do, because Eddie Murphy is a big Star Trek fan and he made it known that he wanted to be in a Star Trek movie. So they had originally approached him to be in this movie, and I don't know, I've read different things and I've seen interviews with him say different things where basically he was going to be the scientist in whatever the plot was going to be. He was going to be the person in our time, or in the 1980s, I should say, and then he was going to encounter the crew of the Enterprise. And they decided against that for a few reasons. Number one, they didn't really want this to be, because Eddie Murphy at that time was huge, so it would have been an Eddie Murphy movie with Star Trek in it, and they didn't want it to be that because this movie came out on the 20th anniversary of Star Trek, so they really wanted to prop up this as a Star Trek movie. And when they sent the script's ideas over to Eddie Murphy, he didn't really care for the fact that he wasn't going to be a part of the crew. He wanted to be a member of either the Enterprise or Starfleet or something. He wanted to be a person in that time frame, so they couldn't really agree on what they wanted to do with this movie, which I think ultimately worked out better for this movie at any rate. Because yeah, if this would have been an Eddie Murphy movie, it would have been a full-on Eddie Murphy movie. However, I will say Star Trek, since then, I don't know what y'all have been doing. I mean, if Eddie Murphy wants to be in a Star Trek movie as whatever, Admiral or a captain, get him in the movie, damn it. Let's see. I have mentioned this before. All of these movies, well, exception of Star Trek Motion Picture, they have done all of this amazing stories, and this one is a fun comedy, and they've got all this stuff going on, and they do it all in, this one comes in just under 2 hours. So I will praise any movie that does that under 2 hours, and I will remind filmmakers nowadays that you can do that in under 2 hours. And my final positive for this movie, and come on, all you nerds, you know you're with me on this one. When they at the end of that movie, where they're in space dock and they're in the shuttle, and they're like, what ship are we going to get? And they think it's going to be the Excelsior, and they kind of tease you because they're flying right to it. And then the shuttle goes up and over, and there's the Enterprise in all her glory. Come on. Don't tell me you don't love that moment. Oh, even watching it again, I got goosebumps. I was like, there she is. Oh, I love the Enterprise. And then at the end, when they're testing her out and they're ready to go and they fly out, oh, it was so great. I mean, you're just happy. You're like, the crew's back. They're on the Enterprise. She's brand new. She's ready to go. God, they've got adventures coming up that are going to be amazing. What could possibly go wrong after Star Trek 4? What could possibly go wrong after Star Trek 4? So let's go ahead and move into the bad. And with this one, much like Star Trek 2, and kind of Star Trek 3, I struggled a bit to find things that aren't really good in this movie. I mean, there's not much that I could cite that is really negative or detrimental to the movie. A lot of this is just nitpicky. However, I have a category named nitpicky, so I can't really call it that. I will say, as I mentioned in my plot synopsis, yeah, you get another alien probe. This is almost the same kind of plot as Star Trek the Motion Picture, with Voyager coming back to Earth to talk to his maker. Well, that's kind of what this probe is doing, is coming back to Earth to talk to these whales. Although I will give the movie credit, it never explains the probe. There was a bit of trivia on that one where they wanted to have subtitles for the sounds that the probe is making, but Leonard Nimoy was like, no, we can't do that because we want it to be a mystery and we don't want to explain it. We just want it to be this weird 23rd century alien thing. And then that kicks us in gear. So I kind of like that they did it that way. But again, you get the space probe doing the same thing that Voyager did. Lieutenant Savick is in this movie at the very beginning, and then she just sort of disappears, which kind of ties in with my feelings with the whole death of Kirk's son David, how it's barely addressed. Well, again, we'll get to that in Star Trek 6 where they talk about it more, but it's kind of brushed over. But Savick is a part of that, and she gets left on Vulcan. However, there were two reasons, again, behind the scenes stuff for that. One is that there was a scene that was deleted that apparently all of the pomfar that her and Spock were doing in Star Trek 3 led to her becoming pregnant, which I suppose it would if you figure out how many 7 years that he would have gone through as he was aging on that planet. But at any rate, so that was one of the reasons she stayed back on Vulcan to have the child there. But like I said, that was edited out. And also the writers and producer Harv Bennett and Leonard Nimoy, they figured with Spock being there as the Vulcan who is dealing with this weird 20th century culture, they didn't really have a need for her to be there, because then you would basically have two people doing the same thing throughout the movie. So that's why they kind of cut her out of this movie. And this is the last time we see Lieutenant Savick through the rest of the films. And my final negative for this movie, again, I hate even calling them that. I will say, as you watch this movie, and I think every time I watch this movie, I think the same thing. Jillian, she sure is trusting of these strangers that she meets, especially after what they do in the aquarium. I mean, Spock jumps into the water and swims with the damn whales and mind melds with them. And then she sees them like 10 minutes later in the parking lot. She's like, oh, you all need a ride? It's like, come on. Especially in the 80s, that's the height of serial killers. Nobody would do that. But she is very, very generous with her time with these people, especially the more she learns. I mean, if you were sitting there having dinner with somebody and they're like, I'm from the future, you would be like, okay, I need to end this date. Or the part where the bill comes and he's like, we don't use money, which, I might use that. If I ever do on another date again, when the bill comes, I'm going to be like, I just forgot to tell you, I'm from the 23rd century and we don't use money there. So if you could pick that up for me, I'd appreciate it. But again, that's just a small thing. But every time I watch the movie, I just think that I'm like, damn, she is really, really nice. It's a good thing that she does go with them at the end of the movie to a time where people are much friendlier. I don't know how long she would have made it. She probably wouldn't have got to the 90s. At any rate, that wraps up the negatives of the film. So let's move on to the nitpicky. And I know I feel like I'm breezing through this. Maybe I'm getting better at the reviews for these films. They keep getting shorter and shorter. Let's see. As I mentioned, nitpicky, these are things that are neither good nor bad in the movie, just little Hollywoodisms or whatnot, or some things. Most of these I just picked up on as I was watching the movie. I mentioned that Jillian and Kirk have dinner, and they go to this pizza place, and they put the pizza in the box because they have to go because they got to, I think something with Chekhov. He gets captured or whatever. Anyway, so Kirk's like, we got to go. So she drops him off in the park, and Kirk's holding this pizza box, and he's just like flinging this thing around as he talks, because, Shatner, he talks with his hands and stuff, but he's holding it funny. And I'm just sitting there watching like, come on, Captain Kirk. That pizza's going to be fucked up when you open it. All the toppings are going to be flying off of it. It's going to be mushed down in one corner. Nobody's going to want to eat that. And you're ruining everybody's snack, Captain Kirk. Thanks a lot. Now I got to eat the Klingon food on the ship. My next nitpick, this one might get me in trouble. I don't know if I should say this. Oh, in this time and age. Okay, I'm going to say this. As I was watching this movie again, I couldn't help but notice, and maybe it's because I was watching it on a big screen TV. Jillian, I don't know if Catherine Hicks, when she was on set, it was very cold every time she was on set, or she was very excited, but she was definitely had her high beams on throughout most of this movie. And at times, I am a lonely man. It got a bit distracting. I know, I'm horrible. I wouldn't survive in the 23rd century. So yeah, there were a lot of moments where I was distracted and I kept thinking, please, Jillian, get her a jacket or something to put over those things before she pokes somebody's eye out. Oh, I'm a terrible, terrible human being. All right, my last nitpick for this film, as I was watching it, and they bring the whales back to the 23rd century, and they crash into the ocean there, and the whales come out, and they start talking to the probe. The probe is, I guess, happy, and it flies away. I couldn't help but think, these highly intelligent whales who have been hunted, in fact, before they left, they were being hunted by human beings. What if that whale would have been like, hey, these motherfuckers have killed all of us. Do not trust these humans. Wipe this planet out of humans. Just kill them all. Why do we believe that this whale would be so friendly? What if he's like, these people suck, kill them all? Well, except the crew and Jillian with her high beams on. That's awful. But it just made me laugh. What if it all backfired? They're like, oh shit, Kirk, you should have left them in the past. So overall, if you couldn't tell, I absolutely love Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. It is, as I mentioned, it's a delightful comedy. It's a nice change of pace from what we had watched in the previous three films, and it doesn't take itself seriously, which is nice. It's almost, I don't want to call it a parody, but it's almost like the cast and maybe the writers and stuff were just kind of poking fun at Star Trek a little bit, which actually led to, because this movie was very successful, William Shatner was asked to host Saturday Night Live, and he did the famous or infamous, however you want to say it, moment where he's at the Star Trek convention and he starts calling the people there, hey, get a life, just get a life. If you haven't seen that, go look it up. William Shatner, Saturday Night Live, whatever, Star Trek convention. It's priceless, to be honest with you. But again, they did an amazing job. It was smart to do that with this movie. And I know I've talked every time about if you had a non-Star Trek fan ask you, which movie should I watch in these series? This would be the one that I would tell everybody, yeah, go watch this one if you just want to watch a Star Trek movie, or if you just want to start getting into it, because it is very, very accessible to everyone. That's why I think at the time it was the highest grossing Star Trek film. I think it lost that to Star Trek in 2009, the reboot, if I'm not mistaken, but I put my notes away, so I can't remember. But at any rate, it was a massive hit. And it was because people who weren't Star Trek fans could come in there and enjoy the comedy, because it is so well done. There's only really, you get some Star Trek at the beginning of the movie and some Star Trek at the end of the movie. And the rest of it is just this fun little fish out of water, poking fun at us in our current time. Well, in the 80s at any rate. And also poking fun at the whole Star Trek mythos and having a good laugh at Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. You know, it was good stuff, and all the performances are great. So, yeah, I would highly recommend anybody watch this film. If you have friends who are like, hey, which one should I watch? This is the one I would naturally point them to. So, if you haven't watched it in a while, definitely go back again and appreciate the comedic timing of these actors, because they do a great job. And appreciate Catherine Hicks and her pointy nipples. So that wraps up my review for Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. I hope that you enjoyed it. And with all the goodwill that this movie created for Star Trek, we have to follow it up with Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. Oh boy, that could be a long episode. I know this one was pretty short, but as I mentioned, there really isn't anything negative to say about this movie. It's just a good time. So there wasn't a whole lot to really review with the film. Whereas Star Trek V, oh boy, it has its issues. But we will get to that next week. But if you enjoyed this review, I also do reviews of newer films. I usually do a review of a new release in movie theaters review. I have that out Sunday night. And then I usually do a streaming surprise episode about the middle of the week. And that will be something I find on whatever streaming service. It could be a new film, or it could be an older film that I haven't seen before. And I like to do a little review there and keep you addicted to the show. So again, follow the show. Follow me on social media. Leave me reviews. I love to hear from you and participate in the other show. I have a fan contest that I do with those shows. It's a lot of fun. And hopefully you get the fun vibe off of this show, and that's kind of carries over to the other one. So, yes, I am begging for you to come listen to other episodes of my podcast. But I do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to the show. I tell everyone I know I've got the smartest and sexiest audience in all the podcast universe, and you never fail to live up to those high standards, especially if you have pointy nipples. I'm sorry, I gotta stop. Now, as you are traveling around on this blue and green ball, bouncing through the cosmos, I need you to do one thing for me. Live long and prosper.